The professor who would join us at the Robert Jackson Center was Professor David Siegel, the distinguished professor of law at Albany Law School and the editor of the New York State Law Digest. In the legal community, he is an icon. He has been a visiting professor at the law schools of St. John's, New York University, State University of Buffalo, Cornell, and Hofstra. He's a frequent lecturer on civil practice for the bench and the bar. In addition to his legal scholarship, he's an extraordinarily interesting man. Where were you born?
I was born in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn?
I hope you can't hear it.
I can. So you're a Brooklyn Dodger guy.
Oh, Dodger fan from the word go. To this day, my only love of baseball is to see the Yankees lose, because you can't, as a Dodger fan, transfer your allegiances. Yeah.
Excuse me. You mind? Thank you very much. This is Brooklyn. And there used to be a hell of a baseball team here. In 1947, I was a young comedian working my first Broadway show, Make My Manhattan. And on summer afternoons, I would go up to the tar roof of my building with my portable radio, which is as big as a refrigerator, and listen to Red Barber describe the games at Ebbets Field. Oh, there were great teams in New York at that time. The Yankees, the Giants, and then there were the Dodgers. And the Dodgers, they were something special. Brooklyn was a middle-class community between the wars, with good schools and extensive cultural events. In an area so flat and populous, the most efficient means of transportation was the trolley car. To survive in Brooklyn, one had to be a dodger of trolley cars. And this absurdity gave the borough's baseball team its nickname. The Brooklyn Dodgers were an awful team in the 30s. So awful that fans began referring to them as them bums. When the team improved, the label stuck as an affectionate irony. The Dodgers won a pennant in 1941, but selective service hit them hard. While most of the baseball players were overseas serving their country, a man with a vision that would change all their lives came to Brooklyn. His name, Branch Rickey. He had been a poor catcher for the St. Louis Cardinals and a mediocre manager. When he moved into the team's front office, he proved to be an administrative genius, and his Cardinals dominated the National League. Now he was determined to make the Dodgers perennial champions, whatever that required. Brooklyn began to change after the war. The trolley was superseded by the automobile, and all highways led away from Brooklyn. Families left their blocks for split-level homes on Long Island potato farms. As the old dwellers, mostly white, moved out, new dwellers, many black and Puerto Ricans, moved in. Could the middle class survive here? Could the poor begin to thrive here? Could people with visible differences live side by side as neighbors? The pattern was the same in all American cities. But the Dodgers provided Brooklyn with a peculiar inspiration. For there in the little ballpark on Bedford Avenue, something was stirring. Something quite remarkable was happening.
Was that the only game that in which they won the World Series, the last game of the 1955 World Series? And I was sitting in the upper right field stands, thrilled to be there, and I'll tell you something, anybody in the world with a television set had a better view of the ball game than I did, sitting in the upper right field stand. That was my first year of law school, 1955, 50 years ago.
That's right.
50 years ago. You wouldn't realize that I'm that old, would you?
You were shocked here already.
1955, the Dodgers won the National League pennant for the 8th time. 7 times Brooklyn had played in the World Series, and 7 times they had been defeated, forced to wait till next year. But the Dodgers were a great team in 1955. Center fielder Duke Snider, the Sporting News Player of the Year, led the league in RBIs. Gil Hodges, the veteran first baseman, had 27 home runs and hit .289. Carl Furillo, the Reading Rifle, batted .314. But Jackie Robinson's age was beginning to show, and his average had fallen to .256. And pitcher Johnny Padres had had a bad year, although 2 of his most important games were ahead of him. Once again, they faced the New York Yankees, who had already beaten them in the series 5 times in a row. Brooklyn fans braced themselves for more disappointment as New York took the first 2 games, despite the sparkling base running of Jackie Robinson. No team in history had ever come back from so far behind to win a 7-game series.
When 1955's World Series came around, there was that awesome fear that it was going to happen all over again. And in fact, when the Dodgers lost the first 2 games, it seemed like, God, once again, the Yankees are going to do it to us.
Ebbets Field for game number 3. Them bums sniffed the good air of Flatbush and came to life. 8th inning, score tied. Roy Campanella stepped in against Vic Raschi. Campy atoned for previous failures at the plate with that one. His round tripper put the Dodgers out front in game 3, and they stayed there.
But the bat of Roy Campanella and the pitching of Johnny Padres won the 3rd game for Brooklyn 8-3. The Dodgers took the 4th game with home runs by Campanella, Gil Hodges, and Duke Snider. In game 5, 2 more home runs by Duke Snider and another by outfielder Sandy Amoros gave Brooklyn the win. The Dodgers were now ahead 3-2. They had come from behind. But 5 Yankee runs in the first inning of the 6th game built New York an insurmountable lead, and the Dodgers lost. The series stood at 3-3. The 7th and deciding game would be played in Yankee Stadium, enemy turf for Brooklyn fans. It would be Johnny Padres' 2nd series start.
Bob Grimm delivers to Gil Hodges, who sends a fly ball into right center.
In the top of the 6th inning, Gil Hodges drove in his 2nd run of the game for the Dodgers.
Brooklyn leads 2-0.
Johnny Padres had held New York scoreless through 5 innings, but in the bottom of the 6th, the Yankees threatened. He walked Billy Martin. Gil McDougall reached first base on a bunt. The next batter was Yogi Berra.
Everybody is sitting there trying to figure out how fate will turn on the Dodgers this time. Sure, they're ahead 2-0. Sure, the game is more than half over. But these are the Yankees, and something is going to happen.
Gil McDougall off first. Yogi Berra, the batter. The outfield swung way around toward right. Here's the pitch. Berra swings, and he does hit one to the opposite field.
Playing left field was Sandy Amoros.
He makes a sensational running one-hand catch. He turns, twirls.
McDougall was thrown out trying to get back to first, and the next batter, Hank Bauer, grounded out.
The Yankees rally is staggered.
It was the play of the series.
And I think the very fact that that play stuffed the cheers back down 60,000 Yankee fans' throats. It was the emotion of that moment, the surprise of that moment, that elevates the play. Berra never hit the ball that way. Amoros was playing way off the line. So you're thinking, will it bounce high enough to be a ground rule double, or will it stay along that low wall and maybe both runners can score? And then out of nowhere, here comes Amoros, and he's got the glove on the right hand instead of on the left, which makes the play possible. Bam, he's got it.
I knew at that moment we were going to win. There's always these omens in baseball, and somehow when they strike out and they don't do good in a certain inning, you think they're going to lose even if they win. I knew then they were going to win.
The Yankees threatened again in the 8th, but Padres snuffed them out. It was still 2-0 Brooklyn. If Padres could stop the Yankees in the 9th, the Dodgers would win their first World Series.
It's a tense struggle into the last of the 9th. Johnny Padres pitching brilliant ball, 1 out to go. Elston Howard grounds to short. Reese throws to Hodges. Brooklyn wins, and the Dodgers go wild as they mob pitcher Padres, who hurls Brooklyn to its first World's Championship. For the Dodgers, it had always been wait until next year, but this was the year.
Moments have a tendency, I think, to relate to your age. I was more impressionable when I first started. Therefore, the wins and the losses, the euphoria was great, the depression was deeper. I think now I take things in stride, I put them in proper perspective. Maybe a moment in time, a happy moment, would be 1955. Because I knew this team. I knew their frustrations. I had grown up with them, even though I wasn't working with them. The Brooklyn Dodgers had lost to the Yankees in 41. They had lost to them in 47. They had lost to them in 49. They had lost to them in 52. They had lost to them in 53. And it was just, oh, you know, gosh. But in 55, they did the remarkable. They won it. And I was the one who was able to say on television, ladies and gentlemen, the Brooklyn Dodgers are the champions of the world. And that's all I said, not another word. And all winter, people said to me, how could you have been so calm at such a tremendous moment? Well, I wasn't. I could not have said another word without breaking down in tears.
It was grand, boys. It was just terrific, that's all. I just feel wonderful. I don't know what I should say. I just feel great. You ever feel nervous out there? Oh, no, I felt good all the way. I was calm, and I was like a pro out there today, a real pro.
What about
Johnny Padres won the last game?
That was his game. Like another story. I'm an old man. I got stories with anything you mentioned practically.
This law stuff.
I had a student there, Julia Garcia, at Albany Law School about 10 years ago, and she knew I was a Dodger fan. It comes up every now and then, and she says she babysat with Johnny Padres' kids. And I said, well, where does he live? He lives upstate New York, north of Saratoga somewhere. And she's extended a dinner invitation. We never could get. I got to go back to do that again. But there she was, a little connection. Johnny Padres, my great pitching idol, because he finally beat the New York Yankees.
We're going to get really off the subject very quickly. We had Carl Erskine here.
Oh, no Carl.
The very first game of the return of the Brooklyn Cyclone was here in Jamestown. Just so happened, minor league baseball.
The Cyclones that opened up in Coney Island?
Yep. But their first game, game was right here.
I didn't know that.
So I brought Carl Erskine in, and he was terrific.
Yeah.
And Carl Erskine talked all about the fact of his best pitch he ever gave was one that was in the bullpen when the Giants game, the Giants-Dodgers game, 1951, the Bobby benefit, and I love how you tell the story. Could you tell us a little bit more about that Bobby Thompson game and the best pitch you ever threw?
Yeah, that story's been around too, but well, there's always a lot of speculation. You know, how did they pick Branca? Why did they take Newcomb out? We were leading 4-1 going into the 9th, and Nuke, of course, was a strong pitcher, and had pitched real strong in the 8th inning, so there was no indication he was tired. But in the 9th, there were a couple of ground balls that got through the infield. They were just routine ground balls that they got through. Then Lockman doubled. That scored a run, put 2 men on. Then they got the bullpen up. So they got Branca and me up throwing. And Dressen called the bullpen in eventually and said, "Are they ready?" And Suki said, "Yeah, they're both ready." Erskine's bounced his curve occasionally. He said, "Let me have Branca." Well, I threw this hard overhand curveball that Campanella used to tell me, bury it, bury it. You don't want to hang that, you got to keep it down. But it broke straight down, and to be a real good pitch, you just have to bury it right at the guy's shoes, so he'd occasionally bounce one. Well, in the Polo Grounds, there's a huge amount of space from home plate clear back to screen. It's a big area. And I don't know, no one ever asked Dressen that I ever read, or I never asked him, did that have any influence, because Campanella was not catching. He was hurt, and Rube Walker was catching. Rube, as the old Texan told me one time, was slower than pond water. He was just real slow afoot. And if Dressen says, "Boy, we don't want any wild pitch with Erskine in there and Walker, who take forever to get to the screen, let me have Branca." Now, I don't know if that was the reason, but whatever the reason, that bouncing the curveball comment, he says, "Let me have Branca." So Ralph came in, warmed up, and Thompson was a low fastball hitter. The first pitch Ralph threw was a low fastball, right down the gut, and Thompson took it. Well, we all went, "Oh, Ralph, oh God, don't pitch him down there, Ralph." And so now the next pitch is up and in, right where it should be, and Thompson fights it off, hits a sinking line drive into the lower deck of the Polo Ground. So now the game's over, this pennant's over, we're take this bitter loss, and and this infamous incident hangs on forever. So when people say to me, "Carl, what was your best pitch?" I'd say, "I think it was that curveball I bounced in the bullpen."
The Giants had trailed the Dodgers by 13.5 games on August 11th, but then began a breathtaking run for the pennant, winning 37 of their last 44. They tied the Dodgers on the last day of the season, and it's now the bottom of the 9th in the 3rd and final playoff game. New York has just scored, but the Dodgers still lead 4-2 with 1 out. Runners are at 2nd and 3rd. Dodger reliever Ralph Branca is pitching to Bobby Thompson, and baseball history is about to be made. Here's how Giant broadcaster Russ Hodges described the action.
Branca throws. There's a walk back. I saw me, I believe. The Giants won the pennant. 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 Bobby Thompson hits into the lower deck of the left field stand. The Giants won the pennant, and they're going crazy. They're going crazy.
Pinpoint every moment, and the streets that I walked afterwards, because I couldn't face people after that Thompson home run. 1951, yeah. Erskine's not only a great pitcher, he was a great man. Very fine man. He had one of his kids was, I think, a retarded kid, and the pictures of him taken care of and whatnot, which just, Brooklyn fans just adored this guy.
Betty and I had always had an unwritten feeling, I guess, that once the game was over for me as a player, that we would come back to our hometown. But there wasn't that much opportunity in Anderson, Indiana. So the opportunities came to me, some in broadcasting and one with the Van Heusen Shirt Company in New York. Right in the middle of searching for a house in New York or thinking about the move, our fourth child, Jimmy, was born. And I came home for that. Sensed real early there may be some problems. And our doctor suggested we take Jimmy to a specialist to confirm anything that might be. We did that and found that Jimmy did have a Down syndrome condition. Pretty devastating finding for a pro athlete who had 3 healthy athletic kids and had just gone through the trauma of retiring from the sport. Even though the doctor recommended there were good places for Jim, that good care, good kind of facilities he could be taken to, Betty was the strength at that point, and she said, well, Jimmy goes home with us. He's part of the family. Whatever that means, Jimmy's going to be a part of us. At 22, he's not a little child, except in his limitations, he is.
Are you working hard today?
But he goes to a sheltered work program. He's active in Special Olympics. He's learned to swim, rides his bike, runs, throws a softball. Got a pretty good arm, I found out. There's so much normal about a handicapped person. There's only a portion that's so-called abnormal. And I think this is Jimmy's case. He has a share of his life that is not conventional. But I'm convinced that his emotions and feelings, likes, dislikes, desires are very normal in many instances. He used to say, instead of saying no or I don't want it or whatever. So I tried to teach him to say no thank you. And I thought he could do that. But I'm going to stay with him. I'm going to teach him to say no thank you. But he would never respond. He'd only say, One day he ran away next door to our neighbors and set off the alarm in her house, which she had an alarm system. Police came down, very embarrassing for Betty. And she said, if he ever does that again, Carl, you're going to have to really lay it on him. So I told him, you're going to get spanked, Jimmy, if you ever do that again. He did it again a few days later. So I came home, Betty told me, she said, you've got to give him a spanking. I said, okay, Jim, let's go. I took him upstairs, took his pants down, ready to lay it on him good. He looked at me. He said, no, thank you. I knew that little booger, he understands. He knows what's going on. He has a real handhold on life. He just does it his own way.
Jim did real well. Ready? Proud of you. Proud of you. Proud of you.
Well, Erskine, thanks so much for sharing your memories here in Jamestown, New York. You clearly are a class act.
First baseman, Ralph. You missed your goddamn location. I know it.
By the way, between baseball and Jackson, because Jackson had no interest in baseball whatsoever. So I don't even know how to get from there here other than to ask.
Well, let's not go.
Let's ask Professor Siegel, what does Robert Jackson mean to the icon of New York practice?
All right, I'll tell you very simply. I've mentioned this every class, almost every class I've had knows if the subject comes up. He's one of my favorite judges, not from the point of view of the subject matter he adjudicated, because he didn't write that much in my realm of civil procedure, but for his style, the language. He would hurl a thought into your brain so quickly and so thoroughly that you didn't realize that it was mere language that was bringing it there. That was his style. I contrasted style very often. I've done this in class too, with other great stylists in the law. Judge Cardoza from our own Court of Appeals. Judge Cardoza was so smitten with language that sometimes, as you were reading what he was saying about the law, you were preoccupied not with the substance of his discourse, but with the language in which he was doing it. You never had that with Jackson. With Jackson, the law and his statement of it were simultaneous. He was tossing it into your brain. And that's chiefly why I so admired him. Of course, other things. I read one of his books, a book that I very much enjoyed, discovered it while I was in law school, The Struggle for Judicial Supremacy. I don't have to mention that here. I'm sure that's a big part of your activities here. And me, you know, oh, I'd love to be talking about this thing. He pinpointed, to my mind, in that book and in his beautiful Jacksonian language, the moment when Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal was finally accepted by the United States Supreme Court. He pinpoints the day in that book. And that was just another reason that I became more and more addicted to him. The book is so well written and he presents so graphically. When there was a change of mind, it's so characteristic of what's going on today. The court was divided just about 5-4 at this stage, evolved to 5-4 during the early stages of the New Deal. Roosevelt's first administration, the New Deal legislation was knocked over by the Supreme Court unanimously. The Schechter case, the chicken plucker, they call it. Then gradually what had happened is that for some of the other New Deal legislation, there became a fractiousness in the court, and there were 6 judges who were still allied against the New Deal under the Due Process Clause, deprivation of property without due process. They opposed this attempted power of Congress to regulate property rights that way. It became fractious, and there was 6-3. 3 had broken away. Stone, Cardozo, and Brandeis had broken away, became what was the so-called liberal minority. And then for a while, the New Deal legislation, you know, regulatory things, were being knocked down 6-3. And then, of course, Roosevelt, very disturbed that during his entire first term, didn't have the opportunity to appoint anybody to the Supreme Court, and his beloved New Deal legislation was being knocked off by the Supreme Court, then started to make noises about the so-called court packing, to increase the judges from 9 to 15, so as to get more favorable judges on there. And this must have had some effect on the court, because as further cases came along testing it, the 6-3 became 5-4. Chief Justice Hughes having evolved over to the liberal trio to make it a quartet. And now New Deal legislation, some key state legislation as well, key stuff was being knocked down on a 5-4 vote. It became very plain that the swinger was Justice Owen Roberts, because there were 4 members of that court and that conservative panel who wouldn't budge. If you said Roosevelt, they voted no. That's how the thing worked. It was, I think, McReynolds, Butler, Van Deventer, and Sutherland. Decent gentlemen, but very, very rigid. And Owen Roberts is with them. Then at the end of 1936, a case was handed down involving some kind of rights of pregnant mothers or children working or whatever. I'm not a constitutional law scholar. Came out of, I forget, some place in the Northwest, wherever, and it was struck down by 5-4 vote, with Owen Roberts casting the deciding vote in that. And that was the end of 1936. Then into 1937, there were a number of other cases before the United States Supreme Court in which very key New Deal legislation was being tested. And a very key decision day was March 29th, 1937, which in Jackson's book, he lays this out so beautifully. In Jackson's book, he points out, they called it White Monday. He was in the United States Supreme Court. It was a Monday. It was a decision day. And he and others in the staff, I think he was in the Justice Department. I forget. I don't think he was the Attorney General at the time. I think he was the assistant at the time. And he was in the courthouse that day with several confreres. And as they were sitting in their chairs, they couldn't believe their ears as the court began to pronounce. 3 cases came down in which New Deal legislation was being fully accepted, 5-4. What had happened in that brief interim, the first 3 months or so of 1937, Owen Roberts changed his mind. He claimed that there was a distinction between the case he decided before and this case and whatnot. In my judgment, there was no distinction. Whatever it is, whatever dynamic goes along in a society which prompts people in power to understand that new things are needed, new ideas are needed, we're struggling, we're in a depression, we have to have more dynamic movement, it had gotten through to him. And he switched over to the so-called liberal side, 5-4, and sustained the legislation. Number of key things. A few months later, three cases. I cannot give you the names of the cases if they were relevant. I have written down in my wallet, as a matter of fact. That's not important. What 3 cases? A couple of months later, the Wagner Labor Relations Act was sustained, and the New Deal had arrived. Then that also poses another thing which to my mind is ironical. The court packing plan, Roosevelt's court packing plan, was defeated. And historically, it's still recited as if it's a big defeat for Roosevelt. It was defeated after March 29th, 1937. And to my mind, the court packing plan had become insignificant because Roosevelt, having won the war, was not at all concerned about pursuing the battle with the judges. He didn't fight that hard for it after that. And that was March 29th, 1937, documented beautifully in Jackson's book, The Struggle for Judicial Supremacy. I've recommended that book to many students. My own copy was semi-stolen from the St. John's Law Library. I borrowed it, and then I didn't want to give it back, and I asked the dean. He made some kind of dispensation so I could keep the book because it wasn't in publication at the time. Well, there's Jackson for you, and of course some of the quotations he's come up with over the years. I have very often quoted something that's very well known here as well. You know, when the United States Supreme Court decides something and you think they're dead wrong, and I think they're dead wrong whenever they disagree with me. I have a very simple philosophy. He came up with that marvelous expression about that if there were some super Supreme Court sitting over us, speaking as the United States Supreme Court Justice, he has no doubts that they would experience their share of reversals. And then he came up with, I suppose, his most famous quotation, that we are not supreme because we are infallible. We are infallible because we are supreme. That's a very simply stated emotion. Many people have thought, but look at the succinct phraseology in which he put it forth. I've quoted that in classes dozens of times. Dozens of times. I can go on with Jackson, you know. When we go on, okay. See, Jackson was not a proceduralist particularly. He was involved with substantive law and across the board. But he handed down a very significant case in civil procedure, which to this day has enormous influence. 1947. This is in federal jurisdiction in practice, the so-called doctrine. This is going to be a little obscure to your listeners. The so-called doctrine of forum non-convenience, one of these mysterious Latin phrases that lawyers like to throw at you. It means inconvenient forum. And all it really means is that sometimes a case can be brought into court with all the requisite jurisdiction of the subject, of the person and whatnot, but some other forum has more significant contacts with the case, and it ought to be heard there. That invokes this so-called forum non-convenience doctrine, where the court analyzes the context of the present forum, the context of the other forum, and if the other forum has the predominant context, it will simply dismiss this action without prejudice to commencing it in the more convenient forum, forum non-convenience. He did that in 1947 in the federal court system, a case called Gulf Oil. Now, that's how many years ago? 47 to, this is now 2005, so that'll be some...
58 years.
58 years, yes, you're better at math than I am. 58 years. And that is still a very important source of citation whenever any court, state or federal, is trying to gauge its contacts versus the arguably greater contacts of the other forum. Gulf Oil case, Jackson's case, is still prime thing cited, prime case. So he had his finger in that pie as well. He was just a brilliant and practical judge. We knew him, I suppose you know his nickname too, the upstate lawyer. He was known as the upstate lawyer during Roosevelt's administration. What else do I want to tell you about Jackson?
Albany Law School. Albany Law School, he was there for 1 year.
Yeah.
You're there, you are one of the icons from Albany Law School. What's Albany Law School? How do they, from their perspective, how do they treat Jackson?
Well, of course, they're very proud that Jackson was one of their alumni. They make a very big thing out of it. We have the Jackson lecture each year. and his picture's up and prominently illustrated, and all of our students know that Jackson it was in, I think, 1 year at the time. I think his ultimate admission was by the clerkship process, wasn't it at the time? Yeah. But he had 1 year with us, and we're very proud of it. I think we had McKinley as well.
One of the things John Barrett brought forward, which I thought was interesting, is Cardozo, the Allegheny College case, and John, in his article, talks about how Jackson was really 2-5 during his days at the Court of Appeals. Then he goes on to say, we know directly that Jackson, in his days as a young Albany advocate, impressed at least one of his tough and generally well-regarded judges. And he cites this incident. In February 1930, the American Law Institute's council met to vote on candidates who had been nominated for membership. Robert Jackson of Jamestown, then age 38, was one of the nominees. During discussion, a committee member voiced his skepticism. Who is Jackson? I've never heard of him. The ALI's vice president, New York's chief judge, Benjamin Cardozo, responded with certainty with the prophetic, quote, "You will in time." End quote. That's in the minutes.
That's great. Cardozo, it's interesting because Cardozo, of course, is one of the other great stylists in the law. You know, there was a handful, really a handful, when you're reading the opinion, you have to stop and ask, who's writing this? And you have to look back to get the name. Leonard Hand was in that category, Cardozo. Oliver Wendell Holmes. And Jackson. I'd always look back if I didn't notice Jackson was writing the opinion at the outset, just to the crispness of the language. There's a wonderful story about Cardozo that might be relevant to do here. I was with Chief Judge Conway back in 1959. Cardozo was the chief judge until 1932 when he was appointed to the United States Supreme Court. And Judge Conway succeeded him about 4 rounds later. Conway was the chief judge of the New York Court of Appeals, Albert Conway, in the late 50s. And I was his law clerk from 1958 through the end of his term, 1959. Conway, Albert Conway, Judge Conway, told us some interesting stories about his experience over the years in the court, and one of them is a marvelous story about Cardozo. Conway, Albert Conway, was the superintendent of insurance. Look how many years I'm taking you back now. Was the superintendent of insurance in Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration in the late 20s as governor. And as a member of the administration, living in New York City, living in Brooklyn as a matter of fact, he would on Monday morning take that famous train up from New York City. All the bigwigs of state government who lived in the city would take that, the Empire State Express, I think they called it, 806 or 906 out of Grand Central Station, and go off to Albany. Of course, Cardozo at the time was the chief judge in the Court of Appeals, a very prominent person, very well known. And he said, he's talking to us at the table, he says, David, on one of those mornings, big tall man, about 6'2" or 3", Conway, right out of the 1890s. And he said, David, I was on my way to the club car. People, your readers won't know what a club car is, you know. It's tables with tablecloths, and you had dinner, not a little snack bar on the train. And he says, on the way over there, a few feet back, I noticed there's Judge Cardozo sitting over there, that very characteristic curly white hair at the back of his head. So I was going to go, but he was reading something. I didn't want to interrupt him. So I stopped, and I stood there. I stood there for a minute, maybe a minute and a half. Now, that's a long time. And I was watching, he's reading this book. And I was enthralled by this thing. He was reading it, reading. And then he got to the end, he turned the page and read it. And he says to me, David, do you know what that book was? I said, well, no, what was it? He said, David, it was a thesaurus. And he was reading it the way you and I would read a novel. What does that say about his devotion to words, Judge Cardozo? Isn't that fascinating? See, Jackson, that's why you always look back with Cardozo's language. You get so preoccupied with language, you sometimes lose sight of the law. I was once involved in a case, working on a case for Chief Judge Conway, when he was in the Court of Appeals, and I was his law clerk, in which I did some research, and dare I say it publicly, without fear of assassination, I found a decision by Judge Cardozo, which I think was wrong. That must not leave this room. This is a secret. But wrong, because he was so preoccupied with words and whatnot that I think the law fell through the cracks. I never found that anywhere in Jackson's writing. Jackson was from his head into yours, and like a thunderbolt, that's how the words entered into your head.
Tell me about David Siegel. 58, you graduate from St. John's, you do the law clerk for Judge Conway, then where do you go from there?
Well, I got out of law school in 1958, and I worked for Judge Conway for a year and a half as they doing at the end of his term. All right, then I went to work for, I wanted to get into litigation. And I went to work for a law firm, a good little law firm, a good little litigation firm. And I worked for them for 4 months and 3 days. And I became one of the great experts at postponing depositions. To this day, there's no one on the face of this earth who can postpone a deposition as well as I. I was given the opportunity, no initiative, whatever. Everything was responsive. And then I got a call from Dean McNeese, Harold McNeese, who's really been my mentor. He died in 1979. Isn't that one Lucy? Lucille, they're so funny. The other great icon of Jamestown. He died in '79, and he wanted me to. I can't tell you. I went to him and I said I'd like to do some part-time teaching, procedure. I was interested in procedure, and he gruffly told me, he said, "I have no opportunity, no occasions for a part-time teacher of procedure." Gruffly, it was a terrible tease. He said, "But I do have an opening for a full-time teacher of procedure," and he was tendering it to me. I wasn't 2 years out of law school. I was honored to all get out, but I was very much afraid to walk into teach New York practice. Yes, I had a good academic education in the subject. I knew the subject from the books, but I had no practical experience. And I wasn't getting any at this firm, except, of course, in the postponement of depositions. If you ever need a postponement, call me up. I'll tell you how it's done. So I said, I'm honored to death, but I'm really not prepared to teach practice. Let me think about it. Let me hang up a shingle. My own shingle, just number one, and just take all the garbage in the world for a couple of years so I can really see what it's like out there, and then turn to full-time teaching. He agreed. God bless him, he agreed. And he had me auditing and part-time teaching during that 2 years. And I sent out a little notice to all of my friends. I had earned some of their respect in law school. I'd done well there. And I sent out notice to all my friends, my little announcement card, saying, "Send me your garbage," in effect. And every morning the garbage truck drove up to my back door and dumped it. And I ran the gamut of all kinds of stuff, from the most humble involvements with clerks, with sheriffs, criminal side, civil side, corporations. And I got the experience I needed. At the end of that 2-year cycle, I joined the faculty full-time, and I don't know how I would have dared to teach that subject without that 2 years background. I hope to this day, when you read my book, and I know many of you have commented on my book, you'll notice that there's a practical slant to almost everything I write. I just can't say the academic without putting the practical slant on. Well, you deliver it to the sheriff, and yeah, but suppose the sheriff doesn't do it. The sheriff balks. What do you do now? That kind of thing. And that's the experience I got out there in the field, which enabled me to teach, I think, with a much more practical slant than had I gone directly into teaching. To this day, there are too many academics, pure academics in teaching, who have no practical experience. And to my mind, they are less able, in my opinion, less able to impart to the students what they really ought to know when they get out there. There's a chasm, a huge chasm between law school and practice, and the chasm should be closed. There should be a greater alliance there. Some of us try to do that. With what success, we leave others to judge.
If you didn't get into the area of civil procedure practice, what would you rather have done?
You know, I was always interested in civil practice. I never really gave any thought to anything else, even con law. To this day, I'm asked questions. A barber, you can't get into a barber chair without being asked. If he finds out you're a lawyer, he asks all kinds of questions. The taxi drivers, if they find out you're a lawyer, then I have a standard, wonderful response. To all these momentous issues confronting, I say, I don't know. I mind my own business, and my business is procedure. I look at these other things with the interest of a layperson. I read them in the magazines and the newspapers, but I am no expert. I have no aspiration to become an expert. I stayed with civil procedure, and after 45 years of intense involvement with it, I've developed a modicum of expertise in the subject by minding my own business, literally. So there was really nothing else I saw. I wanted to get into practice for a while. That's what I did want to do. And I had an arrangement with a practitioner. Arranged with the practitioner when I got the word from Dean McNeese that Albert Conway, the judge, had asked if I could be his law clerk because I had done some work for him. And believe me, I was flattered as can be, but I had made a commitment to this lawyer. I didn't want to back out of it. So Dean told me, would you talk to this lawyer, see what he says? And this lawyer was a good friend. He became a good friend. He said, if you would take this work in my firm, my little firm here, my one-man firm, instead of the clerkship with Albert Conway, then you're not eligible to be in my firm. A nice little remark. And that's where I was going to go into practice, and then it all veered over to the academic. And of course the academic is not just New York practice, but federal practice as well, conflict of laws, all things tied together, the procedural stuff.
Who was your role model?
Well, I had idols. I had McNeese, first of all, my mentor, who was such a dear friend to me. He got me the Conway clerkship. He started me with McKinney's in writing. He introduced me to my wife. He is the godfather, was the godfather of my first child, Sheila. So, and to this day, all 4 editions, you'll find a big appreciation to Harold F. McNeese. I carried it from one edition to another because it all traces back to him. As I put it in the book, my success is a series of doors he opened to me. I just went through and did my best. Mentor, another role model. You know, I don't think I've ever been asked that question.
Good.
A role model. Role model. Who do I want to be like? I don't recall having that kind of envy of anybody's particular attainments in the law. I admired a lot of judges, but I never wanted to be a judge. That's interesting, isn't it? I've been asked dozens of times. I don't want to. If I have to be a judge, I have to consider criminal law as well as civil law. I have no interest whatever in the criminal law, criminal procedure. Absolutely bores me to death. There's no law involved. It's a question: did he do it or didn't he? The law is clear. Where civil procedure is a vast realm. Many challenging, interesting points. It's a constant challenge. As soon as I think I know too much, I read the next batch of advance sheets, cases coming down, and I realize how much there still is to learn, and that's what keeps you young. That's what keeps you. You have me doing this update with you tomorrow. I got 100 items, and they're all new items since last year. You can't do that in any other subject. Only civil procedure explodes and moves like that. I'll have to think about that role model more.
Well, we recognize, aside from half the Brooklyn Dodgers team, those are the guys that you really... Did you play baseball, by the way?
Nah, I was not much of an athlete. In my later years, I played racquetball a lot and beat a lot of young kids, too. But no, as a youngster, I wasn't that active in sports. I should have been more. As I say, racquetball became my sport. Softball, periodically, but baseball, no.
What's your highlight?
Pardon?
What's your highlight?
Highlight?
Highlight. David Siegel's... You've been involved in this certain area of the law, but also you've been an icon. I mean, your books are on every shelf of every lawyer in New York and other places. And you've met lots of people.
Well, what do you mean by highlight?
Well, people you've met, perhaps a claim you've reached.
I've
marrying your wife.
Met many gratifying moments in the law. One thing about the book that's always been a great source of gratification to me are the royalties. Twice a year we have a little celebration as my popularity with the bar starts to pay off in spades. But no, ask the question again. Let me think about that question again, Greg. What?
Professor David Siegel, you've been almost 50 years in the practice of law, met several folks, and your highlight, the highlight.
Oh, I've had so many highlights I wouldn't know where really to begin. Oh, I got a cute story for you. It's the moment I remember. Back in 1957, my second year of law school, I was in the honors program in the Southern District The United States Attorney's Office, Southern District, the honors program, which means I wasn't paid. That's essentially what it means. I wasn't paid. I was just doing work over there. And at that time, Learned Hand, that whole great panel of Second Circuit judges, Augustus Hand, Learned Hand, Jerome Frank, Charles Clark, fabulous bench up there. We're all in the Foley Square courthouse. And I was there working for my assistant U.S. attorney, and I was up in the library, and I was going down to my floor. And at that time, there were elevator operators in all the elevators. I was in there, and I called my floor, and she goes right past my floor, ignores it. And I said to her, I asked for 15, whatever it was. I asked for 15. And she turns to me, she nudges me, gives me a little elbow like this. She says, Judge Hand, Judge Hand. So I turned around, and there was this one solid eyebrow right across the thing, glaring at me as if to say, I dare you challenge my prerogative. That was a big kick, seeing Leonard Hand. The one and only time I saw him, because he was a great name even then, and that was my God, that was 1957. I had a number of moments like that. And the Cardoza story from Judge Conway, a number of incidents with him. I can relate so many things that... I just did an article about my clerkship with Judge Conway for the New York State Historical Society for the Courts. And I gave a number of personal references and that personal involvements with Judge Conway in that thing, which would be apropos of something today, but worthwhile repeating it. Highlights, my God. Well, you should have asked me in advance. I would have thought of the highlights of my life.
Take away from that.
Passing the bar. You know, at that time, the bar was two separate exams. It was an adjective exam and substantive. First, one day substantive law, the next day procedural law. Separated. It's been merged now for decades. But at that point, when I took the bar exam in 1958, on the procedural part, I sent them to the law books. That's the detail I gave on the procedure that I was writing up. They had to check me out, because I was chapter and verse. I was enthralled with that subject. On the substantive part, I didn't even know whether I passed. It was like an aptitude test. So I was on pins and needles till I learned that I passed, and I ultimately learned that I passed. And another cute thing happened with being the chief judge's law clerk. The chief judge and the Court of Appeals are the overseers of the Board of Law Examiners who give the bar exams. And annually, I didn't notice at the time, annually the Board of Law Examiners makes its annual report to the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals about how the schools did and how the students did and whatnot. And preparing his mail in 1959, one of the things in the mail was the report of the Board of Law Examiners for 1958 when I took the exam. Cute story. And I went through it. I was enthralled by this, where the schools finished and whatnot. Now, what they did then, I don't know if they still do it, in addition to showing how the schools did, they list the names of those who finished in the top 1% on the bar. The top 1%. There were 1,916 who took that bar. The statistics were right there. And there were 19 names listed. My name was on the list. I was thrilled to death with it. Number 14. I was number 14 of those who finished in the bar out of 1,916. But you know how ego works on you? And you know how conceit and vanity take over? You got to watch it all the time. After I thought about that list for a while, the thought that crossed my mind is, who the hell were these other 13? That was a highlight too, you're seeing how I did there. Court of Appeals statistics. I guess I've had a lot of wonderful happenings. Keep going. Maybe you'll remind me of something else. One thing after the other leads to another.
Well, tomorrow, Chief Justice William Rehnquist announces that he's going to retire. I don't know this. Just to say,
yeah.
Who's next? Who's President Bush going to nominate?
You see, now that's getting into something where I have my emotions are in line with that, because I'm a partisan. You know, and to take that kind of position one way or the other, I don't know how appropriate it is. My expertise is civil procedure, and on these other subjects, I'm nothing more than, I hope, a reasonably intelligent layperson. Now, Rehnquist is extremely conservative, far more conservative than I would love to know how Jackson would vote on the present United States Supreme Court with the various issues coming up there. Jackson, in my understanding, my feeling, could not be niched. I don't think you could call him a conservative or a liberal. He called the shot as he saw it. I'd be so anxious to see now where he'd be with this increased, of course it's inconsistent, but this increased diminishment of federal power in deference to the states. When his book, The Struggle for Judicial Supremacy, and his own involvement there was really the struggle for federal supremacy under the Due Process Clause. So I would be absolutely enthralled to know how Jackson would vote on all these major cases coming down now. How he would vote on the, the emotional issues of the time, like the abortion cases, Roe versus Wade and things like that. I wonder if John Barrett could possibly, with his insights into the character, mind of Jackson, might reflect on that and tell us where he thinks Jackson.
Are you on his list, his email list? If you, when the day is done, or maybe if you give me your email, John sends out little missives
about Jackson.
About Jackson, there'd be something current, whether it's the Shivo case, Terry Shivo, whether it's something.
Yes, the Shivo case. Where would he vote with that?
He's got little nuggets that will kind of not necessarily tell you where Jackson would land, but here's how Jackson viewed such and such. Let the reader draw their own conclusion. But it's wonderful.
I'd rather he draw the conclusion for me. I'd like to find out what his view is as a great expert on Jackson, where he thinks Jackson would vote.
He's a little reticent about, what would Jackson do. He doesn't want to necessarily jump in the shoes, but he'll give you enough nuggets so you can figure it out yourself. But you would love to see that because he just keeps, once a month, throws out something.
Yeah, that I would enjoy receiving. Believe me, much more than the email I usually get. Yeah, I sure would. Josh is over at St. John's. See, that was on my alma mater. That's why.
Your paths ever crossed with John?
No, they haven't. Not only I didn't meet him until the talk over at the Albany Law School when he spoke on Jackson. We were in touch on the telephone a few times. Otherwise, no. Our paths didn't cross. He was not at St. John's when I was. I was at St. John's till a student there and studying in '55, and then on the faculty until '72. And then I went to Albany full-time, but visited at St. John's for a couple of decades.
Well, John's experience right now, because he has become the national expert on Jackson, but to your question or comment was they couldn't pigeonhole Jackson. Therefore, there is no biography to speak. There's one, Eugene Gerhardt, America's Advocate, 1958, and Gene's still living in.
Yes, I know Gene, yeah.
But outside of that, there have been several attempts, and we've got the files of those people who attempted, but because they couldn't pigeonhole Jackson, conservative, liberal, whatever, he was just merely a pragmatist. Therefore, it was difficult to write the biography. And John, who's now inherited all of this research, is right in the middle of it, and he's trying to get his hands around it.
And hasn't got him around them yet, huh?
He'll get it.
I hope so. I'd like to hear what he has to say.
And currently, he's working on Jackson's year and a half at Nuremberg.
And then there's little personal things in the background, personal rivalries between and among the members of the court. There were another thing there. I think I read recently that Jackson and Black were not speaking for a while, which is most unfortunate, I think. Black was one of the most visceral liberals ever to have inhabited the court. He was Roosevelt's first appointee. And I would have thought that he and Jackson, Frankfurter, would have all hit it all off well. But these personal animosities arise.
It's a wonderful story. In fact, we heard it on this stage a couple of years ago. We brought back the law clerks of Jackson in the 1940s. And John moderated, and it was marvelous because each of them talked a little bit about Jackson, of course, and for those that were here, John got into the Hugo Black thing. And you could just see the eyes dart among the clerks. Is this the time where we can talk about it, the relationship? And then all of a sudden, magically, the lights in this whole place went down. We lost power. We're in the middle of taping this for C-SPAN, and the power goes boom. So we had lights. We broke. They broke for half an hour to repair the electricity. The clerks went out among themselves saying, should we talk about it? Came back, lights on, started all over, went back to the question, and all of a sudden, these guys, it was like Niagara Falls.
They shut it out, huh?
They came right at it. This was what Hugo Black was like. This is what Jackson's reaction.
I would like, is that on tape?
Yeah, and we'll get you a copy.
Oh, if you can get me a copy, I'd be enthralled by that too. I'm most sure they would.
Magic for me.
Yeah.
And they just felt enough time had lapsed and everybody was deceased. Let's tell this.
That's right. It's history, and we're entitled to know it. Oh, I'd love to see that. Yeah.
Your history. I'm glad you're telling us.
Well, I'm very flattered you say that. Huh?
This is a highlight for us, and I said I'd take you on. I'd get you here for half an hour. We're now 40 minutes into it, and
Are we 40 minutes into it?
and when we have the answer to those highlights and those other things, and more Brooklyn Dodger stories, we may come right back here and talk about it.
So the Cyclones this past summer.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed, next to the old Steeplechase Park site. Cody, that's another one of my loves.
Well, and the other thing that you would enjoy, I got copies of my tape with Carl Erskine. I spent about 3 hours interviewing him, and most articulate, wonderful
Gentleman, yeah.
Oh, absolutely, and he had stories. In fact, he's got a book out called Tales from the Dodger Dugout. If you don't have it, you must get it.
I would get it. Of course, I have read The Boys of Summer. Everybody's read that book. And Carl Erskine figures prominently and with great respect in that book.
But this is Carl's recollection of stories while he was in the dugout.
Is it still in print, this book?
Yeah. So go on the
give me the name of it and I'll pick it up.
Tales from the Dodger Dugout, Carl Erskine. So if you Google Carl Erskine, it'll come right up. It's a $10 paperback, but it's terrific.
Yes, I gotta write it down. And another thing, I'll write it down afterwards and take your time on that one.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
A nice quiet dinner here tonight and tomorrow.